I'm a Holocaust survivor, but only very, very recently am I able to even talk about it. I was born in what became the Warsaw Ghetto. And I lived with there's a family, I had a family of 12 people, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. And when I was 1 year old, Hitler invaded Poland. That was 1939. Within 3 years, out of that dozen people, only my mother and I were still alive. And I saw for the next 60 years or so, I saw how my mom was tormented about the Holocaust until her dying day at the age of 90. So really for 60, 65 years, I kept a major emotional distance from the Holocaust in my childhood because I didn't want to go through what she was going through. Then 6 years ago, I saw the documentary movie, Paperclips, and I had an epiphany. That was, maybe my story has value. And that is why I'm here with you today. How to begin? 6 million is a huge number. It's very difficult to comprehend it. It's impossible to really feel its magnitude. But let's put it into human terms. 6 million Jews murdered in 5 years is about, averages to 1,200,000 every year, or 100,000 murders every month. If you consider that the population of Seattle is about 600,000, that means that every 6 months, the Nazis murdered as many Jews as everyone living in Seattle. They continued that for the 5 years of the war. That is just absolutely unbelievable. And probably if it wasn't for my mother's resourcefulness and sheer luck, we would have been among those 6 million. Now for my story and the Warsaw Ghetto. The Nazis put a wall around about 2% of the area of Warsaw, and that became the Warsaw Ghetto. Yet the Jewish population of Warsaw was 30%. So when you consider that the Nazis packed everyone in the Warsaw region into the ghetto, and yet there were, there was only room for those people who were already living there. Where did the newcomers go? Where did they live? Well, if they were lucky, if they knew someone who lived in the ghetto like we did, or had friends or family, they would move in with them. And I remember when I was about 3.5 years old, suddenly about a dozen strangers moved into our apartment. And I remember asking my mom, because they were sleeping on the couches, on the floor, in the living room, in the hallway, the kitchen, everywhere. And I remember asking my mom, who are these people? What are they doing here? And my mom said, well, they're friends. They'll be with us for a little while. And indeed, once the Nazis were satisfied that they've collected all the Jews from the entire Warsaw region and shoved them into the ghetto, they started shipping out the occupants of the ghetto and sending them to concentration camps and to the gas chambers. In addition to all the Jews that died in the concentration camps, about 80,000 Jews died in the Warsaw Ghetto, many of them right on the street, be it from starvation, from disease, from exposure to cold weather. A scene that I remember very well is shown on the next slide. Oops. The Nazi invasion of Poland. I remember this scene because I went through this almost. You see here families being led out from their courtyard through the gate, guarded by Nazi soldiers. And my grandmother and I, one time, were herded into our courtyard with our neighbors, ready for shipment. Except at the last moment, I remember seeing my mom running in through a gate like this, holding a piece of paper in her hand. That piece of paper was a document which she got from the factory director where she worked in the ghetto. And the document allowed her to keep her family in place. With this document, which was in effect a temporary permit to continue living. My mom managed to convince the Nazi officer leading that day's sweep to let us go. Had she arrived a few minutes later, it would have been too late, because my fate would probably have been like that little boy that you see right there. He probably lived about a week or two after this photograph was taken, because from here they were taken directly to the freight yards, put on freight cars and cattle cars, and shipped directly to concentration camps. And all children and older men and women, or weaker ones, were almost immediately sent to the gas chambers. So if my mom had arrived a few minutes later, I wouldn't be here today. What happened after this? Well, my mom was a very, very smart woman. She was a young attorney before the war. And she realized sooner than most people what was the fate of everyone that was being shipped out. She decided to, and managed to, smuggle herself and me out of the ghetto. The first thing she did was to dye her black hair blonde so she would blend in better with the typical Polish population. She bought the identification papers of a young Polish Catholic woman who died, and she took on her name, and then she went to work. At first, she had some good jobs. She became an English governess or a French governess for children of wealthy Poles, because my mom learned English and French at the university. When these jobs ran out, she took anything she could, and that included being a cook, a maid, a scrub woman, whatever, as long as the job involved room and board in the apartment of the people who were hiring her, so that she wouldn't have to go out on the street to go back and forth to work, where she could be picked up by Nazi patrol or police. She also needed some cash to pay to the people who were keeping me. So my mom survived by luck, strength, and wits. I survived by luck only, and I'll give you an example of my luck. One of the first families with whom I lived, Polish families, I remember I was sitting at a table eating soup. It was getting dark, and somebody was lighting a kerosene lamp on the table. And suddenly there was loud banging on the front door and loud shouts in German. And everybody rushed to the front door, but I didn't. I just kept sitting there eating. Why? Probably because I was hungry. I was hungry through most of the war years, but that was not unusual. And I kept sitting there eating until all of a sudden I sensed somebody was staring at me. I remember looking over to the side, and there was a Nazi soldier standing right next to me, staring down at me. I remember he had on a heavy dark green winter coat and a machine gun on his shoulder. And I remember staring at the machine gun because it fascinated me. And then I looked at him and I smiled. I don't know why. And I went back to eating my soup. He stood there another moment or two, and soon he left, and all the other soldiers left the apartment. All was quiet again. I learned after the war that had I shown any fear whatsoever, he would have made me drop my pants to see whether I was circumcised, because only Jews were circumcised in Poland at that time. And if that happened, I would have never reached my 5th birthday. Luck. Another example. In August 1944, there was an uprising throughout Warsaw. That was about a year and a half after the ghetto uprising. And in August 44, I was at that time living with a family, Polish Catholic family headed by a man named Leon. And on the first day of the uprising, he loaded his family, his wife and little daughter and me, on a pedal-powered rickshaw that he obtained somewhere. And we drove it out of the city on that rickshaw. And he told me that they were going to his cousin's farm. Once we got out of the city in the countryside, he finally stopped to rest. And I wandered away along a ditch that ran beside the road. And all of a sudden I saw lying there in the grass a dark blue object, kind of like a large potato, just lying there. So I picked it up. It felt cold and heavy like metal. I started playing with it, and it had a shining ring on one end of it. And I remember pulling on it, and it came out in my hand. And just at that moment, Leon called that we were leaving. So I tossed the object over my head, with my shoulder like this, and it fell into the ditch. And I ran to the rickshaw. And just as I was scampering onto the rickshaw, the huge explosion where I had just been. That dark blue object was a German hand grenade. And had Leon called me a few seconds later, I wouldn't be here today also. Again, luck. The Warsaw Uprising lasted about 3-4 months. And at the end of it, this is what Warsaw looked like. It was a total, total ruin. I stayed with Leon and his family on the farm into January of 1945. And all of a sudden, my mom appeared there. I had not seen her for 6 months, so I didn't know when I would see her, or I really didn't know whether I would see her ever again. I was very, very happy, obviously. And about a week later, my mom woke me up, shook me awake when I was sleeping. She had tears in her eyes, and she said, "You are saved." And I didn't know what she meant, but she took my hand and pulled me out of bed and dragged me behind her to the main room in the farmhouse. And there were soldiers there, but they had olive uniforms, not the dark green ones of the Nazis. My mom bent down to me and said, "They're Russian. They're fighting the Nazis." And when the commander of the troops, it was a tank, when the tank commander saw me, he reached into his pocket and he took out a little white cube and he handed it to me like this. And I didn't know what it was. My mom said, "That's sugar, take it, taste it." Well, I put it in my mouth and it was absolutely the best taste I have ever had my whole life. And ever since then, I've had a tremendous sweet tooth. I can start dinner with dessert, have dessert as the main course, and end it with dessert. And I'd love to do it occasionally, except my wife, Mimi, who was sitting right there, she wouldn't let me. And she's probably right, as always. About a week later, I think, a week or two, we learned that the Russians have pushed the Nazis out of Warsaw. So we returned to Warsaw. My mom very quickly got a job with a brand new book publishing house that was started by the communist government to print books and propaganda. And her job was to open up bookstores throughout Poland that had been closed during the war. Here's a photograph of my mom and me in 1945, that summer. It was a very happy time for me because I thought my mom would never again send me away and have me living with strangers. Well, 2 years later, early 1949, so 4 years later, my mom was chosen by the Polish communist government to go to France to set up Polish bookstores in France for the Polish immigrant community to try to entice them back. And because there was no one left alive in our family, they either had a choice of sending both of us or none. So they allowed my mom to take me with her. And by the way, this is my mom and me in summer of 1949 in Paris. So I was, at this point, I was 11 years old. And my mom that summer defected, went to the American embassy, applied for a visa to come to the US for herself and for me. Her visa came through later that summer, and in September she left to go back to come to the United States. My visa didn't. So once again, she found some strangers to leave me with. So she parked me with this couple living in Paris, and during the couple of months that I lived with them, I would wander all over Paris every day, ride the metro, walk everywhere, picked up French, street French, not proper French, but I could communicate. And then my visa eventually came through, and on the 1st of December, 1949, I came to the United States. I was 11 years old. Went to a small town in North Carolina, 1,000 population. I didn't speak a word of English. My mom right away put me into school, so I had to sink or swim, learn quickly, and she was right. I learned pretty quickly. So by the time we left North Carolina, about a year and a half later, I was fluent in English. We went to Oregon, and I went 4 years to high school there. And in high school, my English really became fluent. I even lost most of my accent. I also started and lost a horrible, horrible stutter. And I got in high school, I learned about the American dream, that in America, if you are really, really, really want something in your life and are willing to work hard for it, you can get there despite or regardless of what your family background is. I learned it, and I really got to believe it. And I worked very hard in high school to get some good grades. And finally, my senior year, my math teacher advised me that I should applied to MIT for aeronautical engineering because I had a love of airplanes. Ever since that time in 1942 that you saw in the very first slide, the airplane that was flying overhead in the shed where I was hiding. Ever since that day, I loved airplanes. I've done a lot with airplanes. But that airplane flying free in that blue sky when I was constrained in a dark shed, that was the love. That was the first and the reason for my first love with airplanes. I met my very first Holocaust denier at MIT when I was a freshman in 1955, and I was shocked and disturbed by by his attitude or her attitude. And that stayed with me until 6 years ago when I viewed the documentary film Paperclips. Almost immediately, I realized that my story has value, so I wrote a book, Neither Yesterdays Nor Tomorrows. And I thought I was done. I put the book immediately on a free access website so anybody could read it and print it on their computer for free, but I thought I was done with that. Except that I almost immediately got a call from the head of MIT, Hillel, asking me to come to Boston and to speak on April 10th, 2010. That was the Holocaust Remembrance Day, and they were arranging an event at the Boston Holocaust Memorial, downtown Boston. My first reaction was, hell no, I didn't bargain for this. But I thought about it, and I decided, okay, I'll do it. So I went to Boston, I spoke. I would choke at least half a dozen times. But enough people came up to me afterwards and said, you got to keep doing this. So right after that, we returned home. Mimi and I returned home to San Francisco. And I almost immediately learned about the Holocaust Center from my good friend, Richard Gumpert, who was sitting right there. And I learned about the center's education program that's focused on students who are old enough to understand, yet young enough to still have an open mind. And I decided to start speaking in high schools and middle schools. My very first 2 talks were arranged by the Holocaust Center in October of 2010, one in Seattle and one in Tacoma. And they both were eye-openers for me. First, because I was amazed at the openness and the sensitivity of the kids. Sensitivity to both my story and towards themselves. And also, they were very much open in their feelings to the letters that they started sending me afterwards. The second thing that really impressed me was the dedication and inspiration of the teachers that created these kind of emotions in the students. 2 years later, I met Michael and Danielle the first time that I spoke at the Kent Mountain View Academy. And in the 5 years since my very first talks here in Seattle, I've spoken to student groups ranging from 30 to 300 or 400. I've spoken about 90 different venues on both coasts of the US and also in Poland to about 6 different schools. And after most of these talks, I get a pack of letters. It always amazes me how much sensitivity and understanding there is in the students' letters and their openness, and how much they relate to my story. They always find something that relates to their life, to what I tell them. Instead of just filing these letters, I wanted to share it somehow with others. So my wife, Mimi, and I started taking excerpts that were memorable from them and putting them on my website. When the number of excerpts on the website grew to a huge number, because I probably have received several hundred, maybe 1,000 letters by now. So when the number of excerpts got very, very large, we chose the most meaningful and most sensitive and heartfelt of those excerpts, and we put them into a book, my second book, Yesterday's Revisited. And I'll share with you right now 2 of those excerpts, one from a student and one from a teacher. But I hope that you will read either the excerpts on my website or in my book to see the reaction that these talks produce in students and the impact it has on them. This one is from a student. I was most affected by your statement that as human beings, we need to stand for something, not against something. All too often, we think of things that divide us and make us different, not the things that bind us together. And your words encourage us to take positive action, just like one of the 3 items of the center. And here's one from the teacher. This was a teacher education program that I participated in. She writes, I give you here a small piece of what I've taken from your story. 1, motivated me to be a better person. 2, inspired me to see the story behind the person. 3, rekindled my passion for teaching history and people. 4, gained confidence to teach what I think is valuable. 5, gave me courage to speak up. And 6, encouraged me to hug my kids. I love that. I review these excerpts every once in a while for myself, to remind myself why I do this. Because every time I speak to a class, it's much longer than this, and I always still choke. And my answer to myself is, I do this because I make a difference. And I thank the Holocaust Center for helping me make that difference. And that's why I support them, and that's why I continue and I increase my support. So I hope you do too. Thank you.